The sound of crushing metal filled the morning air as 20 tons of steel and gravel slowly rolled over the pristine white Rolls-Royce. Margaret's screaming voice cut through the mechanical noise, but I did not stop. I could not stop. This moment had been building for months, and every single pound of pressure grinding her luxury car into scrap metal felt like justice finally being served. She had pushed me too far. She had blocked my driveway one too many times. She had cost me contracts, threatened my livelihood, and treated me like I did not belong in this neighborhood just because I worked with my hands instead of a keyboard. But Margaret made one critical mistake. She assumed I would always back down, always take the abuse, always let her win. That morning, as my dump truck finished its slow journey across her precious status symbol, I realized something powerful. Sometimes the only way to deal with a bully is to show them exactly what happens when they mess with the wrong person. Moving to Hillcrest Estates felt like winning the lottery. After 15 years of building my construction business from nothing, I finally had enough money to buy a home in one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in town. The houses were massive, the lawns looked like golf courses, and every driveway seemed to showcase a different luxury car. It was everything I had worked toward, everything I had dreamed about when I was starting out with nothing but an old pickup truck and a toolbox. My business had grown steadily over the years. I specialized in residential construction and renovation work, and my reputation for quality craftsmanship had earned me steady contracts throughout the city. The dump truck was essential to my operation. I used it to haul materials to job sites and remove debris when projects were completed. It was not the prettiest vehicle, but it was reliable, legal, and paid for. Most importantly, it represented my independence and success. The house I bought at 47 Maple Drive was perfect for my needs. It had a large driveway that could accommodate both my personal vehicle and the dump truck, and the garage was big enough to store tools and equipment. I had checked the HOA regulations carefully before purchasing, and nothing prohibited commercial vehicles as long as they were properly registered and maintained. I thought I had found my piece of the American dream. That dream started turning into a nightmare 3 weeks after I moved in. I was loading equipment into my truck early one morning when I noticed a woman watching me from across the street. She was probably in her 50s, impeccably dressed even at 7 in the morning, with perfectly styled blonde hair and the kind of jewelry that costs more than most people make in a year. Her expression was not friendly. Margaret Whitman introduced herself later that day. She knocked on my door with a clipboard in hand and a smile that did not reach her eyes. She explained that she was the president of the Hillcrest Estates Homeowners Association and wanted to welcome me to the neighborhood. The welcome lasted about 30 seconds before she got to her real purpose. "I could not help but notice that large truck in your driveway," she said, her voice dripping with false politeness. "I am sure you understand that we have certain standards in this community. That vehicle is quite unsightly and frankly inappropriate for a neighborhood of this caliber." I explained that I ran a legitimate construction business and that the truck was essential to my work. I showed her the HOA bylaws that clearly allowed properly registered commercial vehicles. Margaret listened with the patience of someone waiting for a child to finish speaking before the adults resumed their conversation. "Perhaps you misunderstood when you bought here," she said, her tone becoming sharper. "This is not that kind of neighborhood. People here do not operate businesses from their homes, and they certainly do not park industrial equipment where it lowers everyone else's property values. I am sure there are other communities that would be more suitable for your lifestyle." The way she said lifestyle made it clear what she really meant. I was not their kind of people. My money might have been good enough to buy the house, but my occupation made me unworthy of living there. I kept my temper in check, and politely explained that I had every right to park my legally registered vehicle on my own property. Margaret's smile disappeared completely. "We will see about that," she said, turning on her expensive heels and walking back to her house. As she climbed into her pristine white Rolls-Royce, I realized that my quiet life in Hillcrest Estates was about to become very complicated. The first violation notice appeared on my door 3 days later. It was an official-looking document accusing me of violating Section 14.3 of the HOA Covenant regarding unsightly vehicles and equipment. The fine was $200, with additional penalties if the violation was not corrected within 10 days. I read through the reference section carefully and realized that Margaret was stretching the interpretation beyond any reasonable meaning. Section 14.3 specifically prohibited inoperable, damaged, or unregistered vehicles from being stored on residential property. My dump truck was fully operational, well-maintained, and properly registered with the state. I had documentation for everything. Margaret was fishing, hoping I would not know my rights or would not fight back. The second notice arrived a week later, this time citing commercial activity in residential zones. Again, she was misinterpreting the rules. The HOA bylaws prohibited running businesses that generated customer traffic or stored inventory on residential property, but they said nothing about parking commercial vehicles overnight. I was not operating a business from my home. I was simply parking my work vehicle in my own driveway. Margaret escalated her campaign by calling an emergency HOA board meeting. She sent notices to every homeowner in the development, claiming there was an urgent matter affecting property values that required immediate attention. The meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at the community center, and attendance was strongly encouraged. I showed up prepared. I brought copies of the HOA bylaws, my vehicle registration, my business license, and documentation showing that my truck met all legal requirements. About 30 neighbors attended, most of them looking confused about why they had been summoned on such short notice. Margaret stood at the front of the room like a prosecutor addressing a jury. She had prepared a presentation complete with printed photographs of my truck taken from various angles around the neighborhood. She had been stalking me, documenting my daily routine, building a case like I was some kind of criminal. "As you can see," she said, pointing to the photos with a laser pointer, "this industrial vehicle is completely inappropriate for our community. It creates noise when starting up early in the morning. It leaves diesel exhaust fumes that drift into neighboring yards. Most importantly, it sends a message to potential buyers that this neighborhood is declining in quality and exclusivity." She had done her homework, I had to admit. She presented charts showing average home values in communities with and without commercial vehicles, statistics about noise complaints, and even photographs of other upscale developments with strict vehicle policies. She was building a narrative that painted me as a threat to everyone's investment. When Margaret finished her presentation, she opened the floor for questions. Most of the neighbors seemed uncomfortable with the whole situation. A few asked reasonable questions about the specific rules and whether my truck actually violated any written policies. Margaret deflected these questions by focusing on community standards and protecting our investment. Then she made her direct demand. "I think we can resolve this situation amicably," she said, looking directly at me. "Mr. Peterson simply needs to find somewhere else to park that monstrosity. There are commercial storage facilities available throughout the city. This is not an unreasonable request." I stood up and calmly explained my position. I had purchased my home legally, following all HOA rules and regulations. My vehicle was properly registered and maintained. I was not violating any written policies, and I had no intention of paying for commercial storage when I had a perfectly legal right to park on my own property. Margaret's facade of reasonableness cracked. "This is exactly the kind of attitude that destroys neighborhoods," she snapped. "You bought a house here, but you refuse to respect the community standards that make this place special. If you wanted to live like that, you should have bought somewhere else." The meeting ended with no resolution, but Margaret had achieved her real purpose. She had turned my neighbors against me, or at least made them uncomfortable with the situation. Over the next few days, I noticed people avoiding eye contact when I was outside. A few stopped by to apologize privately, saying they did not agree with Margaret but did not want to get involved in the conflict. That was when Margaret escalated to personal harassment. She started parking her Rolls-Royce at the end of my driveway, not completely blocking it but making it difficult to maneuver the dump truck in and out. It was petty, vindictive, and perfectly calculated to cause maximum frustration while staying just barely within legal boundaries. The war had officially begun. Margaret's parking strategy was diabolical in its simplicity. Every morning at exactly 8:30, just as I needed to leave for work, her white Rolls-Royce would appear at the mouth of my driveway. She never blocked it completely, which would have been obviously illegal. Instead, she parked just close enough to make backing out my dump truck a complex, time-consuming process that required multiple attempts and careful maneuvering. The first few times, I approached her diplomatically. I would walk over to her car and politely ask if she could move to give me more room to get out. Margaret would look up from her phone with fake surprise, as if she had no idea she was causing a problem. "Oh, am I in your way?" she would ask with exaggerated concern. "I had no idea this was your private street. I thought public roads were available for everyone to use." Technically, she was right. The street was public property and she had every legal right to park there. But her timing was too perfect to be coincidental. 8:30 every morning, right when I needed to leave. She had studied my schedule and was using it against me. The delays started small but grew worse each day. What should have been a simple 30-second maneuver turned into a 10-minute ordeal of backing up, pulling forward, and carefully navigating around her strategically placed vehicle. I started leaving earlier to compensate, but Margaret adjusted her timing accordingly. If I tried to leave at 8:15, she would arrive at 8:10. The situation reached a breaking point when I lost the Morrison renovation contract. It was a $60,000 job that would have kept my crew busy for 6 weeks. I had won the bid based on my reputation and my promise to start work promptly at 7 each morning. The client was particular about timing because they were living in the house during the renovation and needed the work completed before their daughter's wedding in September. On the third day of the job, Margaret's parking game made me 45 minutes late to the job site. My crew was standing around waiting. The homeowner was furious, and I had no good explanation for my tardiness. I could not tell a professional client that I was being harassed by my neighbor over a parking dispute. It sounded petty and unprofessional. When I finally arrived at the Morrison house, Mrs. Morrison was waiting on her front porch with her arms crossed. She did not let me get past the driveway before she started talking. "This is unacceptable," she said. "We hired you because we were told you were reliable and professional. 3 days in a row you have been late, and yesterday you did not even call to let us know you were delayed. We cannot have this kind of disruption during our renovation." I tried to explain, but the damage was done. Mrs. Morrison had already called another contractor, and my crew was dismissed from the job site immediately. $60,000 in lost revenue because Margaret wanted to teach me a lesson about knowing my place in the community. That evening, Margaret approached me as I was checking my mail. Her husband Richard stood behind her like a silent bodyguard, though he looked more embarrassed than threatening. Richard was a quiet man in his 60s who seemed to have given up trying to control his wife's crusades years ago. "I heard about your work troubles," Margaret said with false sympathy. "Perhaps this is a sign that you should reconsider your living situation. There are lovely neighborhoods in other parts of town that might be more accommodating to your business needs." Her smugness was infuriating, but what pushed me over the edge was her next statement. "I am only trying to help you understand how things work here," she continued. "This community has standards, and when someone refuses to respect those standards, there are consequences. I am simply teaching you your place." Teaching me my place, as if I was some kind of servant who had forgotten his station. As if my 15 years of hard work and success meant nothing because I got my hands dirty for a living. As if buying a house in her precious neighborhood did not give me the same rights as everyone else. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. If Margaret wanted to play hardball, I would show her what hardball really looked like. The first thing I did was call my lawyer. David Chen had handled the legal work for my business for 8 years, and I trusted his judgment completely. I explained the situation with Margaret, the parking harassment, and the financial damage I had already suffered. David listened carefully and asked detailed questions about timing, documentation, and witness accounts. "What she is doing is called intentional interference with business relations," David explained. "If you can prove that her actions are deliberately designed to harm your business, you might have grounds for a civil lawsuit. But first, let's make sure you are bulletproof from a legal standpoint." We spent 2 hours going through every aspect of my situation. David reviewed my HOA agreement, my vehicle registration, my business license, and the specific bylaws Margaret was trying to use against me. His conclusion was exactly what I had hoped to hear. "You are completely in the right," he said. "Your vehicle is properly registered, your business license is current, and you are not violating any written HOA rules. More importantly, she has no legal right to block or restrict access to your driveway, even partially. What she is doing constitutes harassment and possibly criminal obstruction." David explained that I had several legal options, but he recommended starting with documentation. "Take photos every day, record the times, note any financial losses you can directly attribute to her actions. Build a paper trail that clearly establishes the pattern of harassment. If this goes to court, you want overwhelming evidence." I started keeping a detailed log of every incident. Photos of Margaret's car positioned at my driveway, timestamps showing exactly when she arrived and departed, documentation of every delay she caused. I also started recording our conversations, which was legal in our state as long as one party consented. The pattern became clear within a week. Margaret was incredibly predictable in her routine. She would leave her house at exactly 8:25 every morning, drive around the block once, then park at the mouth of my driveway at 8:30. She would stay there until I finished maneuvering my truck out of the driveway, then drive away immediately. It was clearly calculated harassment, not coincidental parking. But David's most important advice was about the legal concept of easement rights. My driveway easement extended from my garage to the public street, which meant I had the legal right to unobstructed access along that entire path. Anyone who blocked that access, even on public property, was interfering with my legal rights. "Here is the key point," David explained. "You have the right to reasonable access to your property. If someone is blocking that access, you have the legal right to remove the obstruction using reasonable force. The question is what constitutes reasonable force in this situation. That conversation gave me an idea that was both brilliant and perfectly legal. My dump truck weighed 20 tons when fully loaded with gravel. Margaret's Rolls Royce weighed about 3 tons. If she insisted on parking in my path of egress, and if I had a legitimate need to access my driveway with my commercial vehicle, then any damage to her car would be the result of her illegal obstruction, not my malicious intent. I spent the next week researching every relevant law and precedent I could find. Cases involving driveway access, easement rights, vehicle obstruction, and property damage. The legal principle was clear. If someone illegally blocks your right-of-way, they assume liability for any consequences of that obstruction. I also made sure my insurance was current and that my dump truck was in perfect mechanical condition. I had it inspected, registered, and certified by the State Transportation Department. Every document was properly filed, every requirement was met. When this situation exploded, I wanted to be completely bulletproof from a legal standpoint. The final step was giving Margaret one last chance to resolve the situation peacefully. I drafted a formal letter, reviewed by David, that clearly explained her legal violations and the consequences of continued harassment. The letter was professional, factual, and completely reasonable. It also served as legal notice that she had been warned about the consequences of her actions. I hand-delivered the letter on a Sunday evening when both Margaret and Richard were home. I knocked on their door and waited patiently while Margaret read through the document. Her expression grew darker with each paragraph. "Are you threatening me?" she asked when she finished reading. "I am informing you of your legal obligations," I replied calmly. "You have been interfering with my property rights and causing financial damage to my business. This letter explains why your actions are illegal and gives you an opportunity to stop before there are serious consequences." Margaret crumpled up the letter and threw it at my feet. "Do your worst," she said. "I have been dealing with people like you my entire life. You do not scare me." As I walked back to my house, I realized that Margaret had just sealed her own fate. She had been given every opportunity to back down, every chance to resolve this situation reasonably. What happened next would be entirely her responsibility. Tuesday morning arrived with clear skies and perfect visibility. I had loaded my dump truck the night before with a full capacity of gravel destined for a foundation job across town. 20 tons of stone and sand sat in the bed, making the vehicle as heavy and unstoppable as a military tank. I had checked and double-checked every mechanical system. The brakes were perfect, the steering was tight, and the engine ran smoothly. Everything was ready. I positioned myself at my front window at 8:20, coffee in hand, watching the street with the patience of a hunter waiting for the perfect shot. My heart was beating faster than normal, but my mind was completely calm. Months of planning and preparation had led to this moment, and I felt the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you are absolutely in the right. At 8:25, exactly on schedule, Margaret's white Rolls Royce appeared at the end of the street. She drove slowly, deliberately, like a queen surveying her domain. I could see her checking her mirrors, adjusting her position for maximum impact. She had no idea that her predictable routine had become her greatest weakness. Margaret parked at the mouth of my driveway with surgical precision, leaving just enough room to claim she was not blocking access, while making it nearly impossible for me to maneuver my truck out safely. She sat in her car for a moment, probably checking her phone or applying lipstick, completely oblivious to the fact that her reign of neighborhood terror was about to end permanently. I walked outside and approached her vehicle with the same diplomatic courtesy I had shown for months. Margaret rolled down her window with that familiar expression of fake surprise, as if she had no idea why I might want to speak with her. "Good morning, Margaret," I said politely. "I need to get my truck out for work this morning. Would you mind moving your car so I have enough room to maneuver safely?" Margaret looked at me with the condescending smile of someone who believed she held all the power in our relationship. "I am parked on a public street, which is perfectly legal," she replied. "If you cannot operate your vehicle safely, perhaps you should consider getting something more appropriate for residential areas." "I understand you have the right to park on public streets," I continued calmly. "But you are blocking my driveway access, which interferes with my property rights. I am asking you politely to move your car." Margaret's smile widened. "And I am declining your request," she said with obvious satisfaction. "If you have a problem with my parking, you are welcome to call the police. I am sure they will be very interested in your harassment complaints." The irony of her statement was perfect. She was inviting me to call the very authorities who would soon be explaining to her why everything that happened next was entirely her fault. "Before you make your final decision," I said, pulling out my phone, "I want to show you something." I displayed the formal legal notice I had served her 3 days earlier. "This document explains that blocking my driveway access constitutes illegal interference with my property rights. It also explains the potential consequences of continued obstruction." Margaret glanced at the phone screen and laughed out loud. "Are you seriously trying to intimidate me with legal paperwork? Do you have any idea who my husband's law firm represents? I have more legal resources than you could imagine." "I am not trying to intimidate you," I replied evenly. "I am fulfilling my legal obligation to provide clear warning before taking action to remove an obstruction from my property access." "Take action." Margaret's laughter became even more condescending. "What are you going to do? Push my car out of the way? This should be entertaining." She rolled up her window and turned her attention back to her phone, dismissing me like a servant who had overstayed his welcome. Margaret had just given me explicit permission to do exactly what I had been planning for weeks. I walked back to my house and climbed into the cab of my fully loaded dump truck. The diesel engine rumbled to life with a deep, powerful sound that seemed to shake the entire neighborhood. Through my mirrors, I could see Margaret glance up from her phone, with the first flicker of uncertainty I had ever seen in her expression. I put the truck in reverse and began backing slowly out of my driveway. The massive vehicle moved with deliberate precision, every inch calculated and controlled. Margaret's Royce sat directly in my path, a 3-ton obstacle blocking my legal right of access to the public street. Through her windshield, I could see Margaret's expression changing from amusement to confusion, to the first hint of genuine alarm. She was starting to realize that something was different about this morning, that the power dynamic she had controlled for months was shifting in ways she had never anticipated. I continued backing up slowly, my rear bumper approaching the pristine white hood of her luxury car. Margaret was frantically gesturing for me to stop, but I had warned her repeatedly about the consequences of blocking my driveway. She had laughed at those warnings, dismissed them as empty threats from someone she considered beneath her social status. The gap between my truck and her car closed to inches, then to nothing. Margaret's expression transformed from alarm to pure panic as she realized that I was not going to stop, that months of calculated harassment were about to result in consequences she had never imagined possible. That was the moment Margaret learned the most expensive lesson of her life. The first contact between my rear bumper and Margaret's hood was gentle, almost polite. Just a slight touch of metal against metal, barely enough pressure to leave a mark. But the psychological impact was enormous. Margaret's face went completely white as she realized that her months of calculated harassment had finally met an immovable force. I continued backing up slowly, applying steady pressure against the Rolls-Royce. The luxury car began sliding backward along the asphalt, its tires squealing in protest. Margaret was frantically honking her horn and screaming something I could not hear over the rumble of my diesel engine, but I maintained my steady pace. I had 20 tons of truck and gravel behind me, and her 3-ton car might as well have been made of paper. The sound of crushing metal filled the morning air as my truck's weight began to deform the Rolls-Royce's hood. The pristine white paint cracked and buckled, revealing the expensive aluminum underneath. Margaret's status symbol, her weapon of social intimidation, was being systematically destroyed by the very vehicle she had spent months trying to banish from the neighborhood. Margaret abandoned her car and started running toward me, screaming at the top of her lungs. "Stop! Stop! You are destroying my car. I will have you arrested. This is criminal destruction of property." I could hear her perfectly now, but I did not stop. I had given her months of warnings, dozens of opportunities to resolve this situation peacefully. She had laughed at every attempt at diplomacy, dismissed every legal notice, and continued her campaign of harassment even after being explicitly warned about the consequences. This moment was entirely of her own making. The Rolls-Royce's hood completely collapsed as my truck rolled over it. The engine compartment crumpled like an accordion, sending pieces of expensive German engineering scattering across the asphalt. The windshield spiderwebbed and then shattered completely, showering the interior with safety glass. Margaret's $150,000 car was becoming an expensive pile of scrap metal. "You psychopath!" Margaret screamed, pulling out her phone. "I am calling the police right now. You will go to prison for this." I finally stopped the truck and climbed down from the cab. Margaret was already dialing, her hands shaking with rage and shock. Her perfectly styled hair was disheveled, her expensive outfit was wrinkled, and her face was flushed red with fury. The composed, intimidating HOA president had been replaced by a hysterical woman having a complete emotional breakdown. "Yes, I need police immediately," she shouted into her phone. "A man just destroyed my car with his truck. This is criminal destruction of property. He needs to be arrested right now." I waited patiently while she gave the dispatcher our address and a highly emotional account of the incident. When she finished the call, I approached her with the same calm courtesy I had shown throughout our entire conflict. "Margaret," I said quietly, "you might want to call your insurance company as well. They are going to want to know why your car was illegally parked in someone else's driveway access." "Illegally parked," she shrieked. "I was on a public street. You just committed a felony." I pulled out my phone and showed her the photographs I had been taking every morning for weeks. Pictures of her car positioned to block my driveway, timestamps showing the deliberate pattern of harassment, documentation of every warning I had given her about the legal consequences of her actions. "You were obstructing my easement access," I explained calmly. "I have the legal right to unobstructed egress from my property to the public street. Your car was illegally blocking that access, and I have extensive documentation proving that this was intentional harassment designed to interfere with my business." Margaret stared at the photos with growing horror as she began to understand the legal trap she had walked into. But before she could respond, 2 police cruisers arrived with lights flashing and sirens wailing. Officer Martinez emerged from the first car with the weary expression of someone who had dealt with neighborhood disputes before. Margaret immediately rushed toward him, gesturing wildly at the crushed remains of her Rolls-Royce. "Officer, this man just destroyed my car," she shouted. "I want him arrested immediately. This is criminal destruction of property." Officer Martinez examined the scene carefully, taking notes and photographs. He measured the distance between the wreckage and my driveway, documented the position of both vehicles, and asked both of us to explain what had happened. Margaret's version was highly emotional and completely one-sided. According to her, I had suddenly, and without provocation, used my truck to destroy her car while she was legally parked on a public street. She demanded my immediate arrest and prosecution for felony property destruction. My version was calm, factual, and supported by extensive documentation. I explained the months of harassment, showed Officer Martinez the legal warnings I had served, and provided photo evidence of Margaret's systematic pattern of blocking my driveway access. I also showed him my easement rights documentation and the legal opinions I had obtained regarding obstruction of property access. Officer Martinez studied my evidence carefully, comparing the photos to the current scene. After 20 minutes of investigation, he reached his conclusion. "Ma'am," he said to Margaret, "based on the evidence presented, it appears that your vehicle was illegally obstructing this gentleman's driveway access. He had the legal right to remove that obstruction using reasonable force." Margaret's face went from red to purple. "Reasonable force," she screamed. "He destroyed a $150,000 car. You illegally blocked his property access after being repeatedly warned about the consequences," Officer Martinez replied firmly. "The damage to your vehicle is the direct result of your own illegal actions. If anyone should be cited here, it would be you for obstruction and harassment." The sound that came out of Margaret's throat was not quite human. Months of absolute certainty that she controlled every aspect of this conflict had just collapsed into the devastating realization that she had been completely, utterly, and expensively wrong about everything. The aftermath of that Tuesday morning was even more satisfying than the moment itself. Margaret's insurance company denied her claim after reviewing the police report and my documentation of her harassment campaign. They determined that the damage was the direct result of her illegal actions, not covered under her policy. She was left with a total financial loss of over $150,000. Word spread quickly through Hillcrest Estates about what had happened. The story grew with each telling, but the basic facts remained the same. The HOA president, who had terrorized neighbors with petty violations and harassment, had finally picked the wrong target. Margaret's reputation as an untouchable authority figure was destroyed as thoroughly as her Rolls-Royce. The HOA board held an emergency meeting the following week. Margaret attended, presumably to rally support for some kind of action against me. Instead, she faced a room full of neighbors who were tired of her authoritarian approach to community management. Several residents spoke up about their own experiences with Margaret's harassment, her selective enforcement of rules, and her general abuse of power. By the end of the meeting, Margaret had been voted out as HOA president. The board also voted to revise several of the more ridiculous regulations she had championed over the years. My truck was explicitly recognized as being in full compliance with all community standards. Margaret and Richard put their house on the market within a month. They moved to a different state, presumably to find a community where Margaret could restart her career as a neighborhood dictator. I heard from David that she also faced potential legal action from several other residents who were considering harassment lawsuits based on her years of abusive behavior. My business recovered quickly from the temporary disruption. Word of my stand against HOA tyranny actually brought me new customers who appreciated working with someone who would not be intimidated by petty bureaucrats. The Morrison contract was a painful loss, but it was replaced by even better opportunities. Most importantly, my driveway remained permanently unobstructed. I never again had trouble accessing my own property or getting to work on time. The new HOA leadership was reasonable and professional, focused on genuine community issues rather than personal power trips. Looking back, I realized that the destruction of Margaret's car was about much more than resolving a parking dispute. It was about standing up to bullies who abuse positions of authority to harass people they consider beneath them. It was about defending the principle that property rights matter, that honest work deserves respect, and that sometimes the only way to deal with a bully is to show them exactly what happens when they push the wrong person too far. Margaret learned that expensive lesson the hard way, but it was a lesson that needed to be taught.